The rain came without warning that night, the way it always does in Billings when winter decides it has waited long enough. It fell in cold, straight lines, turning the empty parking lots into shallow mirrors that reflected nothing worth seeing. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists after midnight, when the last honest man has gone home and the rest of the world pretends it doesn't exist. Callum Dre walked through it like a man who had stopped noticing weather a long time ago. He was 58 years old, though most people who passed him on the street would have guessed older. Not because of his face exactly, but because of the way he carried himself. There was a particular kind of weight that settles into a man's shoulders after enough years of hard living, a weight that has nothing to do with what he is carrying in his hands. Callum carried it in his spine, in the set of his jaw, and the way his eyes moved across every doorway and shadow without ever fully relaxing. Old habits, the kind that don't leave even when everything else does. Beside him walked Bowden. The German shepherd moved with the same quiet efficiency as his partner, ears rotating slightly at each new sound nose, working the cold air with the steady dedication of a professional. Bowden was 5 years old, large, even for his breed, with a coat the color of charcoal and amber that the rain had darkened to something closer to black. There was a small scar at the base of his left ear, a pale V-shaped mark that caught the light sometimes in a way that made people look twice. Most people assumed it was from a fight. They were wrong, but Callum did not know the truth of it yet either. He had driven 4 hours to a rescue organization in Denver 2 years ago for reasons he could not fully explain at the time, even to himself. He had walked into a kennel where a dozen dogs had responded to his presence with noise, with urgency, with the frantic energy of animals who understand that attention is a finite resource and must be competed for. All of them except one. At the back of the kennel, sitting very still, a large shepherd with charcoal and amber coloring had watched him from behind the chain link with an expression of complete calm, not indifference. Something more deliberate than that. As if the dog had been waiting for a specific person and had now confirmed that the right one had arrived. Callum had stood in front of that kennel for a long time. He had walked out with Bowden. He had not thought much about why until much later when the shape of things had become clearer. For now it was simply the fact of it. He had needed a reason to be somewhere, and the dog had provided one, and that was enough of an explanation for a man who had learned not to look too hard at the things that kept him moving. They had been in Billings for 4 days, 4 days of walking, 4 days of learning the shape of the city the way a soldier learns terrain, not because Callum planned to fight anyone, but because after 3 years of living this way, mapping a place was simply how his mind made sense of it. He knew which gas station left its side door unlocked after 2 in the morning. He knew which stretch of the rail yard stayed dry under the overhang. He knew the shelter on 5th ran out of cots by 7 in the evening and did not let dogs inside regardless. That last part was the one that mattered most. Callum had slept in worse places than parking garages and covered doorways. He had slept in ditches in the mountains of a country whose name he was no longer allowed to speak, officially wedged between rocks, with his rifle across his chest and his heartbeat deliberately slow. He had learned to sleep the way animals sleep, lightly, always listening, never fully gone. So the cold did not bother him the way it might bother another man. What bothered him was the idea of leaving Bowden outside alone. That was the one line he had not crossed and would not. He turned off the main road onto a quieter street, one of those blocks that exists in the older part of every Montana city, where the buildings are brick and low and have been standing long enough to have opinions. The storefronts were dark at this hour, their signs unlit, their windows showing only the gray reflection of the night. A hardware store, a tax office, a place that sold hunting licenses and fishing gear. And at the far end of the block, set slightly back from the sidewalk behind a wooden planter box that still held the dried remains of Summer Flowers, a bakery. The sign read Ironwood Bakery in simple painted letters, dark green on cream, with a small iron pine branch worked into the corner of the design. The paint was old, but the sign was clean, and that small distinction told Callum something about the person who maintained it, someone who cared about the details even when no one was looking. The front was dark, of course, but from somewhere at the back of the building, faint and unmistakable, came the smell. Bread, warm yeast, and something sweeter underneath. Cinnamon, maybe. The particular smell of flour and heat and time, the smell of a kitchen that had been used daily for decades. Callum stopped walking without consciously deciding to stop. Bowden stopped beside him, looking up once, then forward again. The smell had done something to him he was not prepared for. It had not pulled up a specific memory exactly. It was more like the memory of a feeling. Something from so far back it predated. The Navy predated the training and the missions and the years of learning to turn himself into an instrument. It was the feeling of being somewhere safe, of being expected, of mattering to the particular square footage of the world you were standing in. He stood there for a moment, just breathing. Then he moved around to the side of the building, away from the street, and found a spot under the deep overhang of the back entrance where the rain did not reach. He sat with his back against the brick and his pack between his knees, and Bowden settled across his feet, and that was where they spent the night. He slept better than he had in weeks. Morning came gray and cold, but without rain. Callum was up before 6, which was habit. He washed his face at a gas station 2 blocks over and came back to find the bakery lights on inside, yellow and warm, behind the frosted glass of the back door. He could hear movement within, the low clatter of trays, water running, the particular rhythm of someone who has done the same morning tasks so many times they no longer have to think about them. He did not linger. He took Bowden and walked. The day went the way most days went in a new city. He tried the auto garage on Merchant Street first. The manager was a thick man in his 50s with grease under his fingernails and a direct manner that Callum respected. He looked at the application form Callum had filled out, looked at the 3-year gap in employment history, looked at Bowden sitting quietly outside the window, and said he was not hiring right now. His tone was not unkind, but it was final. The loading dock at a grocery distribution center was next. The supervisor there did not bother with eye contact. She told him they required a permanent address for their records, and that was company policy, and she was sorry. She did not sound sorry. A ranch supply store on the edge of town was the 3rd attempt. The owner, a wiry man whose name Callum did not catch, actually talked to him for several minutes, asked about his background, nodded at the military service with what seemed like genuine respect. Then he glanced out the window at Bowden and said the liability insurance would not allow animals on the property. He seemed to mean it as an apology. Callum thanked him and left. He was halfway down the block when he noticed the young man sitting on the curb outside the garage. He was in his early 20s, thin in the way that comes from not eating regularly, rather than from any particular fitness, with his elbows on his knees and his head down, and the specific posture of someone who has just been told something they already knew was coming, but had hoped would not. There was a folded application form on the pavement beside him. The same garage had apparently delivered the same verdict to 2 different people within the same hour. Callum slowed without stopping. He looked at the young man for a moment. Then he looked away and kept walking because he was in no position to offer anything to anyone, and he knew it, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. But he filed the face away, the way he filed everything, carefully and without knowing yet what he would do with it. 3 rejections in one day was not a record. But it had a particular weight to it in a city this size where there were not many options left to cycle through. He found a bench in a small park near the rail yard and sat with Bowden and ate the last of the food he had carried from the previous town. Half a sandwich and some crackers, He gave Bowden the portion he would have saved for himself and told himself he was not hungry. But that was a manageable problem. It was the kind of problem that had a next step, even if the next step was unpleasant. What was harder to manage was the other thing. The thing that had been sitting in his chest since he woke up that morning, since the smell of the bakery had gotten into him the night before and pulled something loose that he normally kept very tightly sealed. He had been doing well at not thinking about it. 3 years of practice. But the smell had opened a door somewhere, and now the memory was in the room, whether he wanted it there or not. It had been 2019, a Tuesday in April. The mission had run longer than planned, the way they always did, and by the time they were pulling back through the narrow corridor between two ridge lines, the light was wrong and the intelligence had been wrong, and Callum had made a call. He had ordered his team to hold position to wait for extraction in the location they were in, rather than push forward to the secondary rally point. It was a judgment call, the kind that could not be walked back once it was made. He had believed it was right. He had believed it all the way through the extraction, all the way through the debrief, all the way through the flight home and the weeks of paperwork and the medical checks and the formal review that cleared him of any error. He had stopped believing it somewhere around the 3rd month afterward, when the truth of what had happened to Stellan Voss had fully settled into him. Stellan had been 29 years old. He had survived the mission technically. He had walked out under his own power. But the shrapnel that had found him in that narrow corridor between the ridgelines had done damage that did not show itself all at once. Internal, invisible to the initial field assessment. By the time anyone understood what they were dealing with, there were 14 months of surgeries and complications ahead of them. And at the end of those 14 months, Stellan Voss was gone. The review board said it was not Callum's fault. Callum did not agree with the review board. He had played the decision 1,000 times in his head, coming at it from every angle he could think of, and he kept arriving at the same conclusion. If he had ordered the team forward instead of holding, they would have been through that corridor before the contact happened. Stellan would have been safe. The math was simple and brutal, and he had never found a way around it. So he had taken himself out of the equation. Not dramatically, not all at once. It had happened the way most things happen in a life, gradually and then suddenly. First the apartment that felt too permanent, then the job that felt too much like pretending, then the particular morning about 3 years ago now when he had packed what he needed into a single bag and walked out and not come back. He had not told anyone where he was going because he did not know. He was not running. He was simply removing himself from a world that he felt he had forfeited his right to occupy. Bowden pressed his nose against Callum's hand. Callum looked down at the dog. Bowden looked back with the particular expression he had, calm and watchful, and utterly without judgment, the expression of a creature who has decided that wherever this man is, that is where he will be, and that is enough. Callum put his hand on the dog's head. He did not think the word forgiveness. He was not ready for that word. But something in the simple weight of Bowden's attention pulled him back into the present moment, back into the cold park and the gray afternoon and the immediate problem of what came next. What came next was the rest of the day. He spent it doing what he always did. Moving, staying visible enough not to be suspicious, invisible enough not to invite trouble. He knew how to occupy the middle ground of a public space, how to be present without being noticed. Old skills. He watched the city go about its business, and he cataloged what he saw, and he filed it away in the part of his mind that was always quietly preparing for contingencies. By the time the light had gone from the sky, he and Bowden were back on the quiet block with the old brick buildings, not because he had planned to return exactly, but because the bakery was in that direction and the overhang was dry and he already knew the ground. That was what he told himself. The street was quieter than it had been the night before. Most of the shops had been dark for hours. The bakery itself showed only a faint light from somewhere deep inside, the kind of light that comes from a back room, someone working late. Callum noted it without interpreting it and settled himself and Bowden into the familiar spot under the overhang. Then he heard the sound. It came from the alley that ran along the side of the building, a narrow gap between the bakery and the neighboring hardware store. At first, it was just a voice, a woman's voice, sharp with alarm. Then the sound of something hitting the pavement. Then the voice again, higher now, unmistakably frightened. Callum was on his feet before the sound had finished forming in his ears. He moved around the corner of the building without slowing, Bowden matching him stride for stride, and what he saw in the alley took less than a second to assess. An elderly woman, small and white-haired, backed against the brick wall. Two men between her and the street. One of them had her purse by the strap and was pulling. The other was close, too close, using his size as the threat it was meant to be. The light from the street caught the face of the one nearest the wall. It was the young man from the curb outside the garage, the one with the folded application and his head down, and the posture of someone absorbing a blow he had seen coming. He looked different now, harder around the edges, the way people look when they have decided that the system has already written them off, and they might as well confirm it. Callum registered this in the same second he registered everything else, and then he moved. He did not shout, he did not announce himself. He simply stepped into the alley and his voice came out the way it had come out on 100 missions, not loud but absolute, carrying the kind of authority that reaches into the part of a man that exists before thought. He said one word, stop. Bowden moved left, flanking wide, low, and silent in the way he had been trained, putting himself between the second man and any exit in that direction. The men turned. They saw Callum in the dim light from the street, the set of his shoulders, the absolute stillness of someone who is not afraid of them, and that stillness was its own information. What happened next took about 12 seconds. The man with the purse released it. His partner moved backward. Bowden held his position without sound, which was somehow worse than growling. Callum did not advance, did not touch either man, but he also did not move from the center of the alley. He simply waited the way he had learned to wait, with his full attention and no urgency at all. The two men left, quickly, without looking back. Callum watched them go. He watched until they had turned the corner and the sound of their footsteps had faded completely. Then he stood for a moment in the empty alley with the rain beginning again on the roof above him, and the image of the young man's face still present in his mind. And he thought about the folded application form on the pavement and the particular defeated angle of someone sitting with a rejection they had not been surprised by. He thought there is more than one way a man ends up in an alley doing something he should not be doing. He did not have a solution for that, but he put it somewhere he would not forget it. He crossed the alley to the woman. She was pressed against the wall, both hands flat against the brick behind her, breathing hard. He kept his distance. He knew what sudden approach looked like to someone who had just been frightened. He crouched down to where the purse had fallen and picked it up carefully and held it out to her without stepping closer. She took it. For a moment she just stood there, catching her breath, and Callum stayed where he was and let her. Bowden had come to his side and was standing quietly, no longer in work mode, just present. The woman looked at the dog first, then she looked at Callum. She was in her early 70s, he estimated. Small framed, but not frail exactly, with the posture of someone who had spent decades on her feet. Her white hair was pulled back practically. Her eyes were dark and sharp and moving through something complicated. She was not looking at him the way people usually looked at him. She was not afraid. She was not grateful in the performative way that embarrassed him. She was looking at him the way you look at something you recognize but cannot immediately name. She said, "Come inside." It came out as a statement, not a question. Callum started to decline. The words were already forming. He had a system. He had a pattern. He knew what happened when you stepped inside someone's warmth and then had to step back out into the cold. He knew the particular cost of that transaction. but Bowden had already taken a step toward the bakery door. The woman had produced a key from her coat pocket and was moving toward it without looking back to see if Callum was following with the particular confidence of someone who does not expect to be refused, not because they are arrogant, but because they are certain. Callum followed. The inside of Ironwood Bakery was warm in the way that only a kitchen that has been running for hours can be warm, a heat that has depth to it, that lives in the walls and the wooden floor and the air itself. The smell from outside was nothing compared to this. In here it was full and complex and almost unbearably human. Bread and butter and something with apples. Coffee old and fresh, at the same time the smell of a pot that is always on. Callum stood just inside the door and did not move further. The woman moved behind the counter with the efficiency of long practice. She set her purse down. She turned on one more light. She poured coffee into 2 cups without asking whether he wanted any and set one on the near end of the counter where he could reach it without coming further in. He came forward and took it. He held it in both hands and let the heat work into his palms and said nothing. Bowden settled near the door, not anxious, not alert, just settled the way he settled in places he had decided were acceptable. He turned twice in a small circle and lay down with his nose toward the room, monitoring everything with the mild attention of a professional at rest. The woman looked at the dog for a moment. Something passed across her face that Callum could not read. She said her name was Harriet Voss. She said she owned the bakery and had for 30 years. She said it the way someone says a fact that is also a kind of identity, the way a man might say, I served, meaning it is not simply what I do, but what I am. Callum told her his name. He did not offer anything else, and she did not ask. What she said next was quiet enough that he almost did not catch it at first. She said there was a room at the back, a storeroom that her late husband had put a cot in years ago for the mornings when he started baking at 3, and did not see the point in driving home and back. She said the cot was still there and the room was warm because it shared a wall with the oven. She said Bowden was welcome inside. She said all of this while wiping down the counter, not looking at him in the tone of someone reading items off a practical list. Callum set down the coffee cup. He had a response ready, the same response he had used to decline offers for 3 years, the one that kept things clean and kept him moving and kept the cost of human warmth from accumulating into something he could not afford. It was a good response. He had refined it over time. He did not give it. Instead, he stood there for a moment in the warmth of the bakery while Bowden breathed steadily near the door, and he felt something he could not name pressing against the inside of his chest. Not quite grief and not quite hope, but something in the neighborhood of both. He said he would take the room for one night. Harriet nodded once as if that was the answer she had expected, and turned to rinse the coffee cups. What Callum did not see because he had looked away at that moment was what happened when she turned, the way her hand found the edge of the counter and held it briefly, the way she closed her eyes for just a second, long enough for something to move across her face that was not grief and not relief, but something older than either of those. The way she exhaled slowly, like a woman who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has finally heard it arrive. He also did not see because the light in the back hallway was low what was on the wall beside the door to the storeroom, a photograph in a plain frame. A young man in navy uniform standing straight, one hand resting on the head of a large German shepherd with a pale V-shaped scar on its left ear. Bowden walked down the hallway ahead of him. The dog stopped at the photograph. He stood there for a long moment, very still, his nose working at something in the air near the frame the way dogs work at something that lives beneath the surface of what humans can perceive. His breathing changed slightly, becoming slower and more deliberate, the breathing of an animal that has encountered something significant and is taking the time to be certain about it. Then he turned and looked at Callum with those steady amber eyes. Then he walked into the storeroom and lay down on the floor beside the old cot. Callum stood in the hallway for a moment looking at the photograph. The light was too low to make out details clearly. A young man, navy, a dog. He looked at it for a few seconds and then looked away, telling himself it was nothing, and followed Bowden into the room. He sat on the edge of the cot and pulled off his boots and set them side by side on the floor, the way he had learned to do in the Navy, always ready, always organized. He lay back on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling and listened to the low sound of the kitchen equipment cycling and the distant sound of rain beginning again against the roof. He told himself he would leave in the morning. He had told himself that before in other towns, other temporary warmths. He knew how to leave. He was very good at it. It was, in fact, one of the few things he still trusted himself to do. He closed his eyes. Bowden shifted once on the floor, settling deeper into the warmth, and was still. Somewhere in the building, Harriet Voss turned off the last light and sat down at the small table in her kitchen and stayed there for a while in the dark, the way a person sits when they are in the presence of something significant and is not sure yet what to do about it. On the table in front of her, barely visible in the thin light from the street outside, lay an old military ID card that had fallen from the pocket of a man's coat in an alley behind her bakery. The name on the card was Callum Dre. She had seen that name before. She had seen it in her son's handwriting in the pages of a small notebook that she kept in the drawer beneath the photograph in the hallway. She had read those pages so many times after Stellan was gone that she could have said certain lines from memory, including the one that said clearly and without drama in her son's particular careful hand, Callum Dre is the reason any of us are still here. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then she put the ID card in her coat pocket and went to bed. In the morning, she would put a tattered apron on the counter before Callum could say he was leaving. She would point at the shelf on the east wall, the one that had been broken for months, the one her son had always said he would fix and never gotten the chance. She would say simply and without drama, Stellan always meant to fix that. He ran out of time. She would not explain who Stellan was. She would not need to. Because Callum Dre would already be standing very still in the middle of her bakery with the smell of bread and coffee around him, and a dog at his feet, and something in his chest would be shifting in a way he had not felt in 5 years. And he would not leave. He fixed the shelf on a Tuesday. It took him most of the morning, not because the job was complicated, but because he did it the way he had learned to do every task that mattered slowly and completely, checking each bracket twice before moving to the next. Harriet brought him coffee at some point and set it on the counter nearby without comment and went back to her work. Bowden moved through the shop with the calm curiosity of a dog reassessing a space he had already decided was acceptable, eventually settling near the flour bins where the warmth from the ovens collected and stayed. By 11, the shelf was solid. Callum ran his hand along it and pushed at the corners, and it held. He had intended to leave after that. Instead, he found himself sweeping the back courtyard because the broom was leaning against the wall and the courtyard clearly needed it. Then he was carrying flour sacks from the delivery truck that arrived just before noon, stacking them in the order Harriet indicated with small, efficient gestures that assumed he would understand and did not explain themselves. Then it was early afternoon, and Harriet put a plate of food on the counter near the register and went to the back without saying anything, and Callum ate, standing up because sitting down felt like a decision he had not made yet. He stayed another night. He told himself it was because the rain had come back. The days that followed had a structure to them that Callum had not experienced in years. Not the rigid structure of military life, which was imposed from outside and carried the weight of command behind it, but something quieter and more organic. A rhythm that came from the work itself and from the particular silence of a woman who did not feel the need to fill every moment with words. Harriet Voss ran her bakery the way she did everything with complete attention and no waste. She was at the ovens by 4 in the morning. She had the first trays out by 6. She handled the counter herself through the morning rush which was modest by city standards, but steady, the loyal regulars of a place that had been in the same location for 3 decades. She did not ask Callum what he was doing or when he planned to leave. She simply worked, and when there was something that needed doing and he was nearby, she said so. He repaired the hinge on the back gate. He replaced a section of weather stripping on the delivery door that had been letting in cold air. He cleaned the gutters along the east side of the building one dry afternoon, working from a ladder with methodical care. When the espresso machine started making a sound it should not have, he took it apart on the back counter and found the issue and fixed it without being asked because it was a problem and he was standing next to it. The townspeople noticed. In a place like this, a stranger doing visible work on a familiar building was something that people registered and discussed quietly and at length. Callum was aware of this the way he was aware of most things without appearing to pay attention. He saw the glances through the front window. He heard the particular quality of conversations that paused when he walked through the front of the shop and resumed when he reached the back. He understood that he was being assessed and that the outcome of that assessment would shape how much friction he encountered. And so he did what he always did in those situations. He kept his head down and his work visible and gave people nothing alarming to look at. Bowden helped in the way that a well-mannered dog in a small establishment always helps, by making the space feel inhabited rather than occupied. He had taken to positioning himself differently throughout the day, depending on traffic near the front in the busy morning hours, when his calm presence reassured people coming in toward the back in the quiet afternoons, when he would follow Francis from the work table to the counter and back with the patient interest of a dog who has decided that this particular human is worth monitoring. He greeted everyone who entered with a look that communicated assessment rather than eagerness, the way a good host looks at a new arrival, taking measure, forming a conclusion, extending welcome on the basis of that conclusion. Within 2 weeks, a woman named Doris, who came in every morning for a bran muffin, was saving a small piece for Bowden and presenting it with ceremony. An old rancher named Phipps, who never said more than 2 words to anyone, stopped one afternoon to watch Callum replace a section of fence along the side yard and offered a specific piece of advice about post depth in frozen ground that was actually useful. A younger man who delivered propane to the block told Callum about a wholesaler where Harriet could save money on a supply she had been overpaying for and seemed pleased to be asked a follow-up question. These were small things, but Callum understood the grammar of them. He had spent his career understanding how trust was built in increments, how each small, reliable action was a deposit into an account that could only be drawn on slowly and lost quickly. He had not expected to need that skill in a bakery in Billings, Montana. But here it was working the same way it always had. What he had not expected was Garrett Purcell. Purcell arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week, coming through the front door with the ease of a man who moves through public spaces as if they exist primarily for his benefit. He was in his mid-50s, well-dressed for the setting, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to being the most financially significant person in a room. He asked for Harriet by name, and when she came out from the back, he smiled the way people smile when they want something and have already decided they deserve it. Callum was near the back shelf, not visible from the front, but within clear hearing range. He did not move closer. He listened. Purcell was interested in the property. This was apparently not the first time he had expressed this interest. He spoke about the opportunity in the market and Harriet's situation with the careful sympathy of a man who has practiced making his ambitions sound like concern for others. He mentioned the building's age. He mentioned the challenges of running a small business alone. He mentioned a figure that he called fair, and which sounded to Callum's ear like a number designed to be accepted by someone who was tired. Harriet said no. She said it the way she said most things, without drama, without explanation, without inviting negotiation. Purcell smiled again and said he understood, and that the offer would remain open and that she should think about her future. He left. Harriet came to the back of the shop and resumed what she had been doing before he arrived without a word. But Callum noticed that her hands, which were usually completely steady, moved with slightly more force than necessary when she set the tray down. And he noticed that she did not look up when she said more to the room than to him that it was the fourth time he had asked, and that the answer was the same as the other three. Callum said nothing, but he filed Garrett Purcell away in the part of his mind where he kept things that were not yet problems but intended to be. The fourth week brought ice, the kind that comes down as rain and becomes something else by the time it reaches the ground, coating every surface with a thin, treacherous layer that the morning light turned briefly beautiful before the traffic destroyed it. Harriet fell on the back step, not badly, more of a controlled stumble that she recovered from before Callum had crossed the yard. But it shook her more than she showed, and that evening she moved more carefully than usual, her hand finding the counter more often. He noticed without commenting. He also noticed in those same days that she came down later in the mornings than she used to, that she sat between tasks more often than she had when he first arrived, that there were moments when she stood at the work table with her eyes closed for a beat longer than the situation required. He said nothing about any of it, but he started coming down earlier himself, quietly getting the first preparations underway before she appeared, so that by the time she reached the kitchen, the heaviest lifting was already done. She never mentioned it. He was not sure whether she had noticed. He suspected she had noticed everything. That night, after she had gone upstairs to her apartment above the shop, Callum sat in the back room with Bowden and did something he had not planned to do. He had been straightening the shelf beneath the old photograph in the hallway, the photograph of the young man in navy uniform with the German Shepherd, when the drawer below it had come open slightly, and the corner of a small dark blue notebook had been visible inside. He had pushed the drawer closed and left it alone. Then he had come back. He was not proud of it. But there was something about the photograph that had been working at him since the first night, something he could not name but could not dismiss either. The man in the picture was young, early to mid-20s, with the particular posture of someone who has been trained to stand straight but has not yet made it entirely natural. The dog beside him had the V-shaped scar on its left ear. He had looked at that photograph a dozen times now. Each time he told himself it was nothing. Each time the nothing would not stay settled. He opened the drawer and took out the notebook. He sat with it closed in his hands for a long moment. Then he opened it. It was a personal journal. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who thought before he wrote and meant what he put down. There were dates at the top of most entries. The earliest ones were from 2017. The latest were from early 2019. He read slowly. The writer was someone who had deployed multiple times and was good at his job and knew it without being comfortable about it. He wrote about specific details of places rather than events, the color of light at a certain hour, the sound a particular kind of vehicle made on a certain type of road, the weight of waiting. He wrote about the people beside him with a specificity that came from paying close attention over a long time. Callum's name appeared on the 14th page. He read the sentence twice, then a third time. It said, Callum Dre is the reason any of us are still here, not because he is the best shot or the fastest or even the smartest, though he might be all three. Because when everything is wrong and moving too fast, and the situation has become something the planning did not account for, Callum goes still. I have watched him go still in the middle of chaos and make a call and be right about it. That is not luck. I do not know what it is. But I know I would follow that man anywhere he asked me to go. Callum set the notebook on his knee. He sat very still. Bowden raised his head from the floor and looked at him with that steady amber attention and then put his head back down. There were more entries, more mentions, not frequent, but they're woven into the fabric of the writing the way important things are woven in, not announced, but present. References to decisions made in the field, small moments that Callum barely remembered seeing from the outside and given a meaning he had never assigned to them from the inside. This person had been watching him the way Callum watched terrain, carefully and for a specific purpose, building a picture of something they considered worth understanding. Then he reached the entries from April 2019. He read them slowly. He had to stop twice. Not because the handwriting changed, it did not, but because the words were building towards something and he could feel it coming and he was not sure he was ready. The entry from April 14th described the mission, not in operational detail, but in texture, the feeling of the thing. It described the corridor between the ridgelines. It described the order to hold position. It said he made the right call. I know everyone will second guess it, including him, especially him. But I was there and I know what I saw, and what I saw was a man making the best decision available with the information available in the time available. We held. The contact came. And yes, I caught something I should not have caught, and I am going to be dealing with that for a while. But 3 other men walked out of that corridor because we held instead of pushed. I know that. Callum needs to know that too. Someone should tell him. The notebook ended 6 months later. The last entry was brief and written more slowly, the letters larger and slightly less controlled. It described a hospital room. It described a window with afternoon light coming through it. It described being tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The last line said, "Tell my mother I was not afraid." Callum closed the notebook. He sat in the low light of the storeroom for a long time, with the notebook in his hands and Bowden breathing steadily on the floor beside him. Outside he could hear the wind moving along the side of the building, and somewhere further off a train working through the rail yard, that long low sound that carries across flat ground at night like a message from somewhere else. He was thinking about April 14th, 2019. He had played that day 10,000 times. He knew every frame of it. He had examined it from every angle, and he had always arrived at the same conclusion that the order to hold had put Stellan in the path of the shrapnel, that a different order would have moved the team through and past, and Stellan would have been fine. But he had not been looking at it from inside the corridor. He had been looking at it from inside his own guilt, which had its own particular gravity, which bent everything that passed through it toward the same conclusion. 3 men walked out because we held instead of pushed. He had not known about the 3 men. He had not let himself look at the 3 men because looking at them required him to also look at the possibility that he had not been wrong. And that possibility was one he had not been willing to sit with. Because if he had not been wrong, then the last 5 years did not make the kind of sense that he needed them to make. He sat with that for a long time. He did not reach a conclusion that night. He was not ready for conclusions. But something had shifted the way a very heavy object shifts when the right amount of force is finally applied from the right direction, not moving yet, but no longer entirely still. In the morning, he put the notebook back in the drawer. He did not tell Harriet he had read it, but he noticed when she came down the stairs at 4 and began the first preparations of the day that he looked at her differently. With the knowledge of what she carried, with the knowledge of what her son had written, and the particular courage it took to write it honestly, with the knowledge that she had let a stranger sleep in her storeroom and had not in 3 weeks once asked him for anything in return or made him feel that a debt was accumulating. He thought about the drawer. He thought about whether it had come open by accident. He was no longer sure that it had. 2 days later, Garrett Purcell came back. This time he did not come alone. He had 2 men with him who were presented as associates and who were dressed too well for the weather in a way that suggested they were not from here. They sat at the front table and Purcell ordered coffee with the ease of a man marking territory with small purchases, and then asked again for Harriet. When she came out, the conversation was different this time. The sympathy was still there, but it had a harder edge beneath it. Purcell mentioned the city's upcoming property reassessment. He mentioned the cost of maintaining an older building to current code. He mentioned an inspection that had apparently been scheduled and about which Harriet seemed to know nothing. His two associates said nothing and did not need to. Their presence was doing its own work. Callum came out of the back. He did not say anything. He simply came out and stood at the end of the counter, and Bowden came with him and stood at his left side, and they were both very still in the way that things are still when they are paying complete attention. Purcell looked at him. Callum looked back. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Callum counted them. Purcell smiled the practiced smile and said he was just having a conversation, and that he hoped Harriet would take the time to think seriously about her future. Then he stood, and his associate stood, and they left, and the bell above the door made its small sound, and Bowden watched the door for another 10 seconds after they were gone. Harriet was very still behind the counter. Then she turned and went back to the kitchen. Callum followed. He stood in the doorway and watched her stand at the work table with her hands flat on the surface and her head down. And he understood that she was doing the thing people do when they are trying to keep something inside them from getting out. He asked quietly whether there was something he should know about. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said there was a loan. She said it the way you say something you have been not saying for a long time. It came out in the flat tone of a fact that has been held in private for so long that speaking it aloud feels like a kind of surrender. She told him about Stellan's last 14 months, the surgeries, the complications, the particular cruelty of a medical system that treats dying as a financial transaction. She had borrowed against the building. She had intended to manage it. And then she had been alone, and the repayments had been difficult, and then more difficult, and she had missed some, and the interest had done what interest does when you are not watching it carefully enough. She said a number. Callum kept his face neutral. The number was not insurmountable, but it was significant, and it had a date attached to it, a date by which it needed to be addressed, or the bank would begin a process that ended in a way Harriet could not survive, not financially, but in the way that mattered more. This building was Stellan. It was her husband before him. It was 30 years of her life poured into 4 walls and a sign that still had the original paint. She said she had not told anyone because she did not want the town looking at her differently. She said she thought she could manage it. She said she was not sure anymore. Callum looked at the kitchen around him. The familiar disorder of a place that was deeply and seriously used. The marks on the work table from thousands of mornings, the shelf he had fixed, the machine he had repaired, the particular smell of this specific place that had gotten into him on the first night and had not left. He thought about the notebook, about April 14th, about 3 men who had walked out. He said he would look into it. She looked up at him then, and there was something in her expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just felt someone else put their hand on it without being asked. She said quietly that she was not his problem to solve. He said he knew that. He went back to work. That evening, after closing, Callum sat in the back room with Bowden and the legal documents Harriet had finally reluctantly brought out from wherever she had been keeping them. He spread them on the floor and read them carefully. He was not a financial expert, but he could read a document and understand its structure and identify the parts that mattered. The situation was serious, but it was not without options. There was a number. The number had a deadline. Between now and the deadline, there was a specific amount of time, and within that time, there were things that could be done. He thought about his bank account. He had not touched the military compensation account in 3 years. He had not touched it on principle, because touching it would have meant accepting something he had decided he did not deserve to accept. The money was there, he knew approximately how much. He had not permitted himself to think about it as something real, something that belonged to the present rather than to a life he had walked away from. He sat with Bowden in the low light and thought about what Stellan had written about April 14th. He was not ready to accept it completely. One reading of a journal entry was not enough to dismantle 5 years of certainty, but it was enough to introduce a question where before there had only been a verdict, and questions, unlike verdicts, required investigation. He folded the documents carefully and set them aside. Bowden put his head on Callum's knee. Callum put his hand on the dog's head and looked at the wall where the photograph hung in the hallway, visible through the open door, the young man in navy uniform, and the dog with the V-shaped scar frozen in some afternoon before everything changed. He stayed like that for a long time. Then he made a decision. Not about the money yet, not about the loan or Purcell or the inspection or any of the specific problems that had a deadline and a dollar amount attached. Those were problems he would address in order the way he had always addressed problems, methodically and without panic. The decision he made was simpler and more fundamental than any of that. He decided to stay, not for one more night, not conditionally, not with the bag packed and the exit route in the back of his mind as a comfort against commitment. He decided to stay the way you decide to stay when you have finally understood that leaving is not freedom, but only a different kind of trap, the kind with no walls that you build entirely yourself. He pulled the bag out from under the cot. He unpacked it. He set his few things on the shelf in an order that made sense for daily use rather than quick departure. His spare clothing folded and stacked. His small kit of tools placed where he could reach them without looking. The photograph, he carried a small square image he had kept in the inner pocket of the bag for 3 years, a picture of nothing in particular, a mountain view from a trail he had hiked once in another life. He set it on the shelf where he could see it from the cot. It was the first time he had taken it out of the bag since he had started walking. Bowden watched this process with great attention, and then when it was complete, stood up and turned twice and lay back down in exactly the same spot, as if to say that this had been his position all along, and he was glad someone had finally caught up. Outside, the wind had died, and the night was very still, and the lights of Billings were a pale orange wash against the low clouds to the west. Somewhere in the city, a life that Callum had spent 5 years believing he had forfeited was waiting in the particular patient way that real things wait, without urgency, without judgment, simply present and available for whenever he was ready to return to it. He turned off the light. He lay down on the cot with his hands behind his head and stared at the ceiling. He did not sleep for a while. But it was a different kind of not sleeping than he was used to. Not the vigilant, hunted wakefulness of a man running from something quieter than that. The particular stillness of a man lying at the edge of a threshold, listening carefully to what exists on the other side, deciding whether he is ready to step through. He was not fully ready, but he was closer than he had been in 5 years, and that for tonight was enough. He opened the bakery at 5:53 the next morning. He had been awake since 3:30, which was not unusual, but this time he had not lain still waiting for the night to end. He had gotten up and gone into the kitchen and stood for a long time looking at the equipment and the layout and the order in which things needed to happen, working it through in his mind the way he used to work through an operation before it began identifying the sequence, the dependencies, the places where a mistake would cost the most. He had watched Harriet's mornings carefully over the past weeks, not because he had planned for this, but because watching carefully was simply how he moved through the world. He knew which ovens ran hot. He knew the particular temperament of the large mixer, the way it needed to be started slowly and brought up gradually. He knew that the bread doughs went in before the pastry, that the coffee needed to be on before anything else, that the front display case had a latch that required a specific angle to open properly. He knew these things the way he had always learned the terrain of any place he needed to operate in. He made mistakes. The first batch of rolls came out darker on the bottom than they should have because he misjudged the rack position. He overproofed the sourdough by 20 minutes because he got caught up in the coffee setup and lost track of the time. A customer came in at 7:15 and asked for a specific pastry that he did not know how to make, and he said so directly, which the customer seemed to find either refreshing or alarming. It was difficult to tell which. But the doors were open, the coffee was hot, the bread was real. The regulars came, not all of them, because some had heard Harriet was in the hospital, and assumed the bakery would be closed and those would need to be reclaimed one morning at a time. But enough. Doris came for her bran muffin and looked at Callum with an expression that contained several questions she did not ask, then reached into her purse and produced a handwritten card with her phone number and said to call if he needed anything. The rancher Phipps came in, looked at the display case, looked at Callum, said nothing, and bought 4 loaves of bread instead of his usual 2. The propane delivery man stopped to refill the tank and stayed long enough to drink a cup of coffee and tell Callum that word had gotten around and that people were pulling for the place. Small things. But Callum understood their weight. By the end of the first week, something had shifted in the shop's relationship to the street. People came who had not come before, drawn partly by curiosity and partly by something else, the particular human instinct that moves toward something that is clearly trying. A retired school teacher named Frances arrived on the 3rd day and sat at the corner table and watched Callum work for a while, and then came to the counter and asked whether he needed recipes. She had been friends with Harriet for 20 years and knew the bakery's full repertoire, and had it turned out been concerned about the place since Harriet's health had begun to decline. She came back the next morning with a handwritten collection of recipes organized by category, and went through the most important ones with the thoroughness of a woman who taught complicated things to people who did not know them yet and had learned exactly how to do it. Callum learned. He was not a natural baker in the way that Harriet was, with her decades of instinct and her hands that knew without measuring. But he was methodical and patient, and he had spent his career learning to do things correctly under conditions that were far less forgiving than a warm kitchen. He made notes. He adjusted. He threw out what did not work and redid it without sentiment. Bowden remained a steady presence in the shop, adapting his position to the rhythms of each day. In the mornings, he sat near the entrance, unhurried and watchful, making the space feel inhabited. In the afternoons, he often followed Frances from station to station as she instructed Callum in the finer points of pastry, watching the process with a focused attention that Frances found flattering. In the evenings, when the shop was quiet and Callum was at the work table reviewing the next day's prep list, Bowden lay beneath the table with his chin on the floor and his eyes half open, the picture of a creature that has found its place and settled into it completely. It was during one of those quiet evenings near the end of the 2nd week that Callum thought again about the young man from the alley. He had not forgotten the face. He had filed it carefully the night of the incident, and it had stayed where he put it waiting. He thought about the folded application and the garage and the posture of someone absorbing a rejection they had expected. He thought about what happens to a person when every door closes in the same week and there's nothing left but the wrong choices. He mentioned it to Phipps the next afternoon, obliquely asking whether the rancher knew of anyone who needed an extra hand for seasonal work, someone who might do well with outdoor labor and clear expectations. He described the approximate age and build without saying how he knew of the person. Phipps looked at him for a long moment in the particular way of a man who understands that the answer to the question being asked is not actually the point of the conversation. Then Phipps said he had a fence project starting the following week and could use a strong back if the person in question was willing to show up on time and do what he was told. Callum said he thought that could be arranged. He did not know whether the young man from the alley would take it. He did not know whether Phipps would be able to locate him or whether the information would travel the right way through the right channels. He had done what he could do from where he stood, which was the most anyone could do, and the rest would have to unfold the way it unfolded. But he felt the small practical satisfaction of someone who has addressed a problem they identified rather than walking past it. It was not much, but it was something, and something was where everything started. At the hospital, Harriet was improving. The doctor said her heart had been under strain for longer than she likely knew, and that she would need several more weeks of rest before she could return to any kind of regular activity. Callum visited on the fourth evening, driving Harriet's old truck, which she had asked him to use, without hesitating, as if lending him the truck were the most natural thing in the world and not a significant act of trust. She looked smaller in the hospital bed than she did behind her counter, but her eyes were the same, sharp and attentive and moving through whatever she was looking at with that particular quality of seeing more than the surface. She asked how the shop was doing. He told her truthfully. The rolls needed work. He had called Francis about the apple cake recipe, and Francis had come in person, which he had not quite anticipated, but which had been useful. The espresso machine had developed a secondary issue that he had not yet fully resolved. Revenue for the week was down from her typical average, but not dramatically, and he expected it to recover as people understood the shop was continuing to operate. She listened to all of this with her hands folded on the blanket and a look on her face that he could not entirely interpret. Then she asked whether Garrett Purcell had been back. He said no. She nodded once, slowly, as if filing that information in the correct place. He did not tell her yet about the loan documents or what he was considering. He was not ready to have that conversation, partly because he had not yet completed what he needed to complete before the conversation would be honest, and partly because she needed to rest, and a conversation like that was not restful. He drove back to the bakery in the dark and sat in the truck for a few minutes before going inside, looking at the lit window of the storeroom, the single warm square of light in the otherwise dark building. He thought about what it had looked like from the street on the first night. Just a smell and a light. The most basic signals a place can send to someone who is cold and moving and has forgotten what it feels like to stop. He thought about how close he had come to walking past it. He went inside and sat at the work table for a while, and then he did something he had not done in 3 years. He picked up his phone and found a number he had not called since a brief failed conversation 6 months after his discharge, and he held the phone in his hand for a long time before pressing the call button. The phone rang 4 times, and then a man answered with the particular caution of someone who does not recognize the number but picks up anyway, because the habit of picking up never fully leaves certain kinds of people. His name was Devin Burke. He had been in the unit, not on that specific mission, but close enough in time and proximity that he had heard the full account from multiple people who were there and had spent his own years turning it over. He and Callum had not spoken since that brief conversation 6 months after Callum's discharge, a conversation that had ended badly because Callum had not been willing to hear what Devin was trying to tell him. There was a long pause after Callum identified himself. Then Devin said, "I wondered when you would call." They talked for a long time. Callum asked the questions directly, the way he did everything without preamble or softening. He asked about April 14th. He asked about the 3 men. He asked Devin to tell him from the outside what the sequence had looked like to someone who had access to the full picture in the aftermath, who had sat with the reports and the accounts and the geometry of what actually happened. Devin told him. It took a while because the truth of a complicated event is never a single straight line, and Devin was precise in the way that people are precise when they know the weight of what they are saying and want to get it exactly right. He described the contact point. He described the angle. He described what the alternative would have looked like if the team had pushed forward instead of holding. and his voice carried the particular measured flatness of someone describing something they have thought about many times in the specific way that military people think about near misses, turning it in their hands like an object looking at all its surfaces. He said if you had pushed them through the contact, would have caught the whole team in the open at the worst possible moment. The geometry was already set before you gave any order. You would have lost more than one man, probably more than two. Stellan caught what he caught because of bad angle and bad timing and a piece of metal that went where it was not supposed to go. That is not a decision. That is a fact of the environment. It was going to find someone regardless. The question was, how many? Callum sat very still in the back room with the phone against his ear. He said Stellan wrote that the hold was the right call. Devin said, I know. I read it. Someone should have made you read it a long time ago. I tried 6 months after. You were not ready to hear it. The silence that followed was long enough that Callum was aware of Bowden shifting on the floor beside him, the dog's steady breathing marking the time the way a clock marks it, reliably and without judgment. Then Devin said quietly, we tried to find you, man, after you disappeared. A few of us looked for a while. We were not trying to tell you something was your fault. We were trying to tell you the opposite. Where did you go? Callum said, I am in Billings. Devin said, what is in Billings? Callum looked at the wall. At the photograph visible through the open hallway door, the young man and the dog frozen in that afternoon before everything changed. He said a bakery. It is a long story. He heard something shift in Devin's voice, a careful sound, the sound of someone deciding whether to say the next thing or not. Then Devin said, Stellan Voss. That is who you are thinking about, right? That is why you called now and not before. Callum said, yes. Devin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, his mother runs a place in Billings, a bakery. I looked it up once, maybe a year after. I do not know exactly why. I think I just wanted to know that there was still something of his somewhere that was real and continuing. The line was very quiet. Callum said, I know. He stayed on the phone with Devin for another 20 minutes, and by the end of it, something had settled in him that he did not have a precise word for. Not closure, which had always struck him as a word invented by people who had not experienced the thing it was supposed to describe. More like a door that had been sealed from the inside for 5 years, had finally been opened from the other side, and the room behind it was not the room he had spent 5 years imagining. He sat for a while after he hung up, then he opened the drawer in the hallway and took out the notebook and sat with it in his hands, not opening it this time, just holding it. He thought about a 29-year-old man writing carefully in a hospital room about light through a window. He thought about what it meant to pay that close attention to the people around you, to record what you saw of them honestly, to leave that record behind for the people who needed it. He thought someone should have told him. He put the notebook back gently, the way you set down something that belongs to someone else and that you have been entrusted with temporarily. Then he went to the kitchen and made himself tea, which he did not particularly like, but which Harriet kept, and which seemed appropriate for the hour and the moment, and he sat at the work table and opened the loan documents again. He had a number in his head. He had been carrying it for days, checking it against the documents, running the arithmetic in different configurations to make sure he had it right. The number in his military compensation account was not unlimited, but it was substantial, the accumulated payment of 20 years of service that he had never touched, because touching it had felt like accepting something he had concluded he did not deserve. That conclusion, like several others he had held for 5 years, was no longer the solid thing it had been. He was not ready to decide everything tonight. But he was ready to make one call in the morning to the number on the bank documents to find out exactly what the process looked like and what the timeline was and what would be required. Knowing the exact shape of a problem was the first step toward solving it. and he was at his core a man who solved problems when he had decided they were his to solve. He had decided. He turned off the kitchen light and stood in the darkened doorway of the storeroom for a moment, looking at the cot with his few things arranged on the shelf beside it, the small photograph from the trail now visible in its place. Bowden was already settled on the floor, his breathing slow and even. Callum stood there and thought about 3 men walking out of a corridor. Then he lay down and closed his eyes, and this time the sleep came quickly the way sleep comes when a man has finally set down something he has been carrying too long. The next morning he made the call and got the information he needed. The number was confirmed. The process was explained to him in the patient tone of someone accustomed to walking people through it. There were forms, there was a timeline. None of it was fast, but all of it was possible, and possibility was what he needed. He made a second call to Devin, who had spent 15 years after leaving the military working in finance and knew things about these specific transactions that Callum did not. Devin asked no questions about why. He simply said, "Here is what you do," and walked him through each step with the same precision he had applied to everything he touched. And at the end he said, "For what it is worth, Stellan would have liked knowing this is where it went." Callum did not respond to that directly, but he stayed on the line for another moment before saying goodbye, and that moment said what he could not yet put into words. The week that followed was the most complicated of Callum's time at Ironwood. Purcell's inspection arrived as a letter on the Wednesday, a formal notice citing 3 specific code items, all of them real, none of them critical, all of them the kind of thing that exists in old buildings and is generally tolerated until someone decides for their own reasons that it should not be. Callum read the letter carefully and then drove to the county office and sat across from a building inspector named Walter Greer, who was direct and not unkind, and asked him plainly which of the 3 items was an actual safety issue and which were documentation issues. Greer looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested he had seen this particular situation before and had an opinion about it that his professional role did not allow him to state directly. Then he said, "The electrical junction in the basement is the real one. The other 2 are paperwork." Callum asked what it would take to address all 3 before the deadline on the letter. Greer told him specifically and completely the way a man gives information when he has decided the person asking deserves to have it. Callum fixed the documentation items that afternoon. The rancher Phipps had a nephew who did electrical work and who came out the next morning and addressed the junction box in 3 hours for a price that was fair because Phipps had specifically told him to be fair about it. Callum stood in the basement and watched the work and asked the relevant questions, and when it was done, he had the certificate and all the paperwork in order before the end of the week. He returned to the county office and filed everything in person, setting the completed documents on Greer's desk and thanking him for his time. Greer looked at the paperwork, looked at Callum, and said, "Tell Harriet that Walter says hello." Callum said he would. He did not hear from Purcell again. Harriet came home on a Thursday, 3.5 weeks after she had left. Callum drove her in the truck. She was quiet on the way back, looking out the window at the streets. She knew the particular quietness of a person returning to a familiar place after a long enough absence that they see it again rather than simply seeing through it. She noticed things he could tell from the way her eyes moved, the new awning on the pharmacy, the tree that had come down in the park. Small changes that accumulate in any living place while you are away from it, and remind you on your return that the world does not pause. When they pulled up in front of the bakery, he had unlocked the front door and turned on all the lights before he left to get her so that the building was lit from inside. When they arrived, the warm yellow light showing through the windows onto the wet pavement of the street. She looked at it for a moment before she opened the truck door. She did not say anything. But something in her face went through a sequence that Callum watched without interrupting. He did not tell her what was about to happen when she walked in. The regulars were there. Francis at the corner table, Doris near the counter with a wrapped package of something she had baked herself and brought as an offering. Phipps standing near the back wall with his hat in his hands, like a man attending something formal, which in its way he was, the propane delivery man. Several people Callum recognized from weeks of mornings, and a few he did not recognize, but who had come anyway drawn by whatever network of quiet phone calls and past messages had moved through the community in the previous 2 days. Someone had put flowers on the counter, yellow ones arranged simply in a glass jar. Someone else had made a sign in large, careful letters that said "Welcome Home" and hung it slightly crooked above the door to the kitchen. Harriet stood in the doorway. Callum stood slightly behind her and watched her take it in. He watched her see each face in turn, and he watched what moved through her as she saw them, something old and real, and beyond the reach of any particular word, the particular emotion of a person who has underestimated how much they are held by the people around them and is discovering the truth of it all at once. She said quietly to no one in particular, well, which was enough. She moved through the room slowly, taking a hand here and accepting a brief embrace there. And Callum stayed near the edge of things and watched and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the particular satisfaction of having done a thing not because he was ordered to, but because it was right and because he was capable of it and because it needed doing, and he was the one standing there. Bowden moved through the small crowd with the practiced ease of a dog who has long since decided that people are generally acceptable and is willing to demonstrate this individually and on a case-by-case basis. When things had quieted and most people had gone, Harriet sat at the corner table with a cup of coffee and Callum sat across from her. The shop was almost empty. The evening light was doing something particular to the front windows, that low amber color that comes in winter when the sun is going and knows it and makes its exit slowly and with intention. He told her about the loan. He told her plainly the way he did everything without building toward it or softening the edges of it. He told her he had reviewed the documents carefully and spoken to the bank and made the arrangements and that they were completed. He told her the debt was settled. He told her he had used his military compensation account, the one he had not touched in 3 years, and that this was the right use for it, and that he had not made the decision lightly or quickly, but had made it with full understanding of what he was doing. She was completely still while he spoke. When he finished, she did not say anything for a long moment, long enough that he could hear the refrigeration unit cycling in the back and the distant sound of a car moving slowly through the wet street outside. Then she said his name. He said, "I know." She said that money was yours. He said it was. Now it is the buildings. She looked at him steadily, the way she had looked at him in the alley on the first night, with that particular quality of seeing past the surface of things to whatever is underneath them, and he let her look because he had nothing to conceal in this, and she had every right to understand it fully. He told her about the notebook. He told her he had read it and that he was sorry for reading something private, but that he was not sorry for what it had told him. He told her what Stellan had written about April 14th, 2019. And he told her that he had spent 5 years believing something about that day that was not accurate, and that her son's words had been the first thing to begin cracking that certainty open. He told her he had called Devin Burke and confirmed it from the outside. She listened to all of this without moving. When he finished, she reached into the pocket of her coat and set something on the table between them. It was his military ID card, the one that had fallen from his coat pocket in the alley on the first night, the night she had found it on the pavement and put it away without telling him. She said, "I knew your name before you told me. Stellan wrote about you more than anyone else in that notebook. I have read those pages so many times since he was gone that I know certain parts from memory, including the part about April 14th. She said I was not waiting in that alley. but I had been waiting in the way you wait for something when you do not know what form it will arrive in. I knew that if you were the man my son described, and if you came here, and if I could simply give you a reason to stop moving for long enough, the rest would be yours to find. I could not give you the truth about that day, only the space to find it yourself. She paused. She picked up her coffee with both hands. She said I left the drawer open on purpose. I am not ashamed of that. Callum looked at the ID card on the table between them. He thought about Bowden stopping in the hallway on the first night, standing very still at the photograph, the V-shaped scar visible even in the low light. He said, "The dog. Tell me about the dog." She looked toward Bowden, who was in his evening position near the front window, one ear up and one ear relaxed, monitoring the street through the glass with the mild professional attention of a creature who has long since established that the perimeter is secure and can now simply maintain awareness without effort. She said Stellan had found him in Afghanistan in 2018, a young dog, not a military animal, but living in the vicinity of the forward position, fed by various members of the unit over the weeks they were there. Stellan had worked with him, trained him with the patience he applied to everything, and the dog had attached to him with the particular completeness that certain dogs reserve for certain people, the bond that is not simply loyalty, but recognition. She said that when Stellan was evacuated in April 2019, he had arranged from a field hospital for the dog to be transported to a rescue organization in Billings rather than left behind. He had done this with the specific and deliberate attention of someone who understood that the details are what matter, who called the right people and gave the right information and made sure it would happen correctly, even though he was in a hospital bed and had other things to be thinking about. She said the rescue had sent her a photograph when the dog arrived in Billings, that she had gone to see him once sometime in the late months of 2019 when Stellan was still in surgery and the outcome was still uncertain, and she had stood in front of the kennel and looked at the dog and had not been able to take him home because the grief was already too present and adding to it felt impossible. She had told them to find him a good placement. She said she had always wondered where he ended up. Callum looked at Bowden. He thought about a rescue organization and a 4-hour drive to Denver that he could not fully explain at the time. He thought about a kennel full of dogs making noise and one large shepherd sitting very still at the back watching the door with the patience of a creature who has decided it is waiting for something specific. He said, "I got him from a rescue in Denver in 2021. I drove 4 hours without entirely knowing why. He was the only dog there that did not make noise when I came in. He just watched me." Harriet smiled. It was a complete smile, uncomplicated by anything else, the first one he had seen from her, that was not carrying something else alongside it. She said, "That sounds like exactly something Stellan would have arranged." They sat in the quiet of the bakery as the last of the day's light finished leaving the windows and the street outside settled into the early dark of a Montana winter evening. The refrigeration unit cycled again. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly. Bowden stood up, stretched in the deliberate full-body way of a large dog, reminding the room of its presence, and then came to the table and lay down between them with his chin on the floor and his eyes moving between one face and the other. Some time passed in which nothing was said and nothing needed to be. Then Harriet told him about the other thing. She said it simply, without ceremony, in the same tone she used for everything that mattered. She said she had been thinking about the building, about what it needed going forward, not in terms of repairs, which were being handled, but in terms of what it was and what it should continue to be. She said she was 72 years old and that her heart had recently made its position on certain subjects very clear, and that she was not going to be able to pretend otherwise indefinitely or even for very much longer. She said she had not discussed this with anyone because she had not known what to do with it until the past few weeks had shown her She said she wanted to structure a formal co-ownership arrangement. She had spoken to her lawyer, a woman who had handled her affairs for 15 years, and the framework was already drafted and straightforward. She was not giving anything away. She was not asking for anything that had not already been given in other forms. She was proposing a partnership with someone who had demonstrated over the preceding weeks that he understood what the place was and what it was for and what it required and what it deserved. Callum started to speak. She said, "Before you say anything, this is not generosity. Generosity is when you have more than you need and you share the excess. This is practical. I need someone who can carry this place when I cannot carry it alone. You need somewhere to be where what you do is real and matters to the people around you." That is not charity. That is simply two people being honest about what they need and deciding to be useful to each other about it. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the night he had unpacked the bag, the small photograph set on the shelf where he could see it from the cot, the particular finality of putting things in an order that made sense for staying rather than leaving. He said, "There is one condition." She raised an eyebrow. He said, "One table. In the front. Reserved for anyone who served. No charge, no time limit, no explanation required." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said Stellan would have put it in the window. He said, "The window then." They did not shake hands. They did not need to. The agreement existed in the space between them with the solidity that real things have when they are built on the right foundation, not performed or negotiated, but simply recognized by both parties at the same moment. He drove home later, which was what he called it now in his mind, without having made a conscious decision to start calling it that. The truck was warm and the streets were quiet, and Bowden sat in the passenger seat with his nose pressed to the gap in the window, the way he always did, reading the cold air as they moved through it, gathering information about the city, from the particular mixture of its smells, cataloging it all with the patient thoroughness of a professional who understands that knowing your surroundings is not a choice, but a practice. Callum drove through the quiet streets of Billings and thought about a notebook in a drawer and a photograph on a wall and a dog who had sat still in a kennel in Denver and waited for the right person to come through the door. He thought about the particular patience of things that are trying to find their way to where they belong. In the weeks that followed, Callum built the table. He built it himself with lumber from the hardware store 2 doors down, whose owner had by now extended him a line of credit on the basis of his reliable payment and the general endorsement of Phipps, who carried a certain weight in that part of the city. He built it from white oak because it was hard and it lasted and it would still be standing and solid long after anyone currently alive had stopped being able to say anything about it. He worked on it in the evenings after closing in the back room, with the door to the kitchen open so he could hear if anything needed attention. He worked slowly and without hurrying the way he worked on anything he intended to last. He jointed the boards himself and let them sit overnight before gluing up. He hand-cut the mortise and tenon joints at the legs because he wanted the connection to be as strong as it was possible for wood to be connected to wood, held not just by glue or hardware, but by the geometry of the joint itself, each piece interlocking with the others in a way that drew tighter under pressure rather than giving way to it. He sanded it by hand through 4 grits, spending more time on each pass than was strictly necessary, because the quality of the surface is the thing you feel every time you sit down and rest your hands on it, and it matters even when no one knows how much work went into it, especially then. He finished it with oil that darkened the grain and brought out the figure in the white oak, that particular warmth that the wood has when it is treated well and allowed to show what it actually is. He made the sign from a piece of the same oak, routed the letters himself with a tool he borrowed from Phipps's nephew, painted them in dark green to match the bakery sign outside. The sign said Stellan's table. For anyone who served, sit as long as you need. He placed it in the window as agreed. The morning he put the table in place, Harriet came down early and stood in the front room and looked at it for a long time without speaking. She walked around it once, running her hand along the edge, the way you touch something you want to understand through more than one sense. She looked at the sign. She looked at the window and the street beyond it and the particular angle of winter morning light that came through at that hour and fell across the table's surface. She did not say anything about the quality of the work or the wood or the joinery. She said he would have been embarrassed by all the attention and then secretly pleased about it for weeks. Callum said that sounds about right. She went back to the kitchen. The first person to sit at the table on the morning it was formally open was a man Callum had never seen before in the shop. He was somewhere in his late 60s with the particular bearing of someone who has spent long enough in a structured life that the posture of it never entirely leaves even after the structure is gone. He came in without speaking and stood at the counter and looked at the table in the window for a long moment before he looked at Callum. Callum looked back. The man walked to the table and sat down and looked out the window at the street. Callum brought him coffee without being asked and set it down in front of him without comment and went back to the counter. The man sat there for an hour and 40 minutes. He did not appear to be doing anything in particular. He was not reading or using a phone. He was simply sitting at a table in a warm room with a cup of coffee looking at the street in the way of a person who has needed a place to simply be for a long time and has finally found one. When he left, he stopped at the counter and put money down for the coffee. Callum pushed it back across the counter. The man looked at him for a moment, a look that contained a number of things that were not going to be put into words. And then he nodded once, the particular nod that means something specific between people who have been in the same places and understand certain things about each other without needing to explain them. Then he walked out and the bell above the door made its small sound and the table sat empty in the morning light. Callum watched through the window as the man walked up the block and turned the corner and was gone. He did not know the man's name. He did not know where he had come from or what he was carrying or what it had cost him to walk through that door. But he knew what the nod meant, and it was enough. That evening, after the last customer had gone and the shop was quiet, Harriet stood at the front window and looked at the table sitting empty in the last of the light. The street outside was settling into the blue dark of a winter evening, the storefronts going dark one by one down the block, the occasional car moving slowly through the wet street. She said he would have loved this. Callum was behind the counter with the day's receipts, organizing them in the methodical way he organized everything, and he did not answer right away. He thought about a young man writing carefully in a hospital room about light through a window. He thought about a dog sitting still in the back of a kennel in Denver waiting. He thought about the particular patience that certain things require, the patience of something that knows where it is trying to go and is willing to take the long way to get there. He said, I think he helped build it. Harriet did not turn from the window. She said, I think so too. Outside, the night came down over Billings, the way it comes down in winter, quietly and completely, and the streetlights came on in sequence down the block, each one finding its moment, and through the warm window of Ironwood Bakery, the table sat in the light, solid and present, and waiting the way something waits when it has been built well and has all the time it needs. Callum put the receipts in their folder and set the folder in its place under the counter. He turned off the counter light. He put on his coat. Bowden rose from the floor near the window where he had been lying with his chin on the boards and his eyes toward the street and shook himself once in the full body way that meant the day was finished and the next thing could begin. He came and stood beside Callum and looked up at him with those steady amber eyes. Callum looked back at the shop. The familiar state of the end of a working day, the trays stacked and the surfaces wiped and the machines settling into their overnight quiet. The photograph in the hallway, just visible from where he stood, the young man in navy uniform with one hand on the shoulder of a dog, both of them looking directly at the camera with the particular ease of people who are exactly where they intend to be and know it. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. He thought about the night he had first come down the street in the rain, walking the way he had walked for 3 years, through and past, and always onward, carrying everything in one bag and leaving no address. He thought about the smell that had stopped him in the dark, the smell of bread and warmth and time. He thought about how close he had come to simply walking past it the way you walk past 100 things in a life because you are moving too fast or too low or too determined to be going somewhere else, to recognize what is right in front of you. He thought some things are patient enough to wait. Then he turned off the last light and walked to the front door and held it open for Bowden, who stepped through, first with the unhurried authority of someone who has done this many times and expects to do it many more. Callum stepped out after him and locked the door behind them. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the pavement was still wet, and it held the reflection of the bakery sign in its surface, the reversed image of the iron pine branch trembling slightly in the light wind off the river, and Callum looked at it for a moment, that imperfect wavering image of a thing that was itself behind him, solid and lit and real. He did not look up the street in the direction he had come from. He looked at the door, at the sign, at the warm light still visible through the front window, Harriet's silhouette moving through the back of the shop, finishing the last of what needed finishing before she went upstairs. He put his hands in his coat pockets. He stood on the pavement in the cold night air with Bowden leaning gently against his leg, the way the dog had taken to standing when they stopped somewhere, not pressed against him exactly, but close, the particular proximity of a creature that has made its decision about a person and sees no reason to qualify it or explain it. The wind moved down the street and the pine branch on the sign swayed slightly and steadied. The night was quiet around them. Callum breathed in the cold air and breathed it out and felt the particular quality of stillness that comes to a man who has stopped running, not because he was caught or because he gave up, but because he finally arrived somewhere worth stopping for. He had spent 5 years learning how to leave. He thought it might take a little less time to learn the other thing. But he had time now. That was the difference. He had a place and a door and a key in his pocket and a dog at his side and a table in the window with a sign on it. And somewhere in the city, a man he did not know the name of had sat at that table for an hour and 40 minutes and then nodded at him on the way out in the way that means I see you and I understand and thank you for this. That was enough to build from. That was, in fact, everything. He stood there a moment more just breathing, and then he moved not away from the door but alongside the building toward the side entrance, Bowden walking with him in the easy match stride they had found together over 2 years and several thousand miles, and the sign above the door held its place in the dark, and the light inside the bakery stayed warm, and the table in the window waited for morning.